I'm a massive dickhead. But more specifically, I'm a massive dickhead when it comes to Lovecraftian games. Games which claim to be based on the works of American horror author HP Lovecraft. So imagine my glee when I saw a game named after one of Lovecraft's most popular stories, which specifically name drops his most popular creation that received lukewarm reviews from the general public. Are you imagining that glee? Good. Because it doesn't exist. Now, the game isn't actually named after the story The Call of Cthulhu, it's instead named after the tabletop RPG Call of Cthulhu, which itself is named after the story, but not exclusively based on it. Meanwhile, the game is more closely based on another of Lovecraft's stories, The Shadow over Innsmouth. Confused yet? Good. Let's jump in. We're playing as a boy called Edward Pierce, a World War I veteran turned detective. Classic Lovecraft character indeed, but there is a twist. He's already a little bit mad. He's having crazy dreams and visions, which isn't particularly standard. Usually, the crazy dreams and visions and whatnot aren't there right at the start, and typically in the detective stories that Lovecraft wrote, they're not happening to the protagonist. In fact, the game opens with a dream so vivid that it vaguely resembles a tutorial. And I have to take a quick break here to ask, when did pre-rendered cutscenes start to look worse than live gameplay? I mean, this is not the only game with this problem, but holy hell, it's noticeable here. I remember in the early 2000s when you'd be shown these wonderful, well-crafted clips before being introduced to the horrifying reality of the game, but now it's the other way around. Game devs, computers are more than capable of rendering in-game cutscenes. You no longer have to flick on Cthulhu Cave 1.mp4 or man walking uneventfully.mov for dramatic effect. Anyway, while playing the tutorial, I start getting a rather uneasy feeling. It's one I've felt twice before. Once in agony, and once in lust for darkness. That is to say, the game is not giving me good vibes. There's janky animations, overly dramatic dialogue, and way too much environmental debris. I'm not talking about clutter, you guys know. I love my clutter, but everything feels so busy, artificially so. I mean, just look at this office, holy hell, who has this much stuff? And it also feels like I'm controlling someone who weighs several times more than a regulation truck. Honestly, it's like swimming in molasses, but without the novelty of the word molasses. So basically, it's another game developer emulating the clunk of good survival horror without understanding what makes that clunkiness good, and also gets overly ambitious with the set dressing. Not a great start. Usually, if a game gave me this impression, I'd probably just stop playing and decide to cover an entirely different one. But, you know, this is Call of Cthulhu, and this is Painticus. I can't not cover this game, so let's just give it some more time and hope it gets better. Anyway, we get our story set up. Detective man must go and detect unusual mystery on an unusual island. Is it the most original setup? No. Does it have to be? No, not really. I've said in the past that Lovecraftian media doesn't have to have wild or unique settings. All of the horror and grandeur of the stories comes from the events that take place within the area and the perception that the characters have of the area. And God knows how many of Lovecraft's works involve a detective/scientist investigating a place that needs detecting/sciencing. While accepting the case, we're introduced to these RPG mechanics which felt a little out of place at the start, but then I remembered this game is, like I mentioned earlier, based on the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, which is, surprisingly, a role-playing game. Now I say it feels kind of out of place at the start because these gamey mechanics don't fit super well to the adventure mystery genre. Like, you know, it doesn't feel super good when I'm no longer allowed to investigate a painting because I put all of my Cthulhu points into gymnastics and animal handling. But despite not fitting in super well at the beginning, the RPG mechanics do start to fit in pretty well as the game progresses and you're given more and more player freedom, to the point where this game is, and I don't think I've heard anyone else say this, teetering on the edge of the immersive sim genre. It's not quite there because the game does hold your hand a lot more than most other immersive sims, and I think honestly the game would have been better off if they fully committed to the immersive sim idea. I mean, S.T.A.L.K.E.R is the game I say is the best Lovecraftian game, and that is very much an immersive sim. This is something I actually elaborated on a bit in the comments section of my best Lovecraftian game video, where I say, I think there's a perfect balance of exploration and linearity that needs to be achieved, where you see enough to raise questions but not enough to fully answer them. Now we fall into a problem with Lovecraftian games where we have to ask, is it more important to capture the atmosphere or to follow the format? Because objectively speaking, Call of Cthulhu follows the format better because it's far more linear, but S.T.A.L.K.E.R captures the atmosphere way better by giving you the freedom to find out these dark truths all by yourself. That's something I'm not entirely sure of myself. I think I still ultimately prefer S.T.A.L.K.E.R's way of doing it, but I will say Call of Cthulhu is very faithful to his original formatting, and I can appreciate that. Anyway, we're given our case and sent off to a strange island by a strange boy who totally isn't hiding anything. And this opening chapter of the island is genuinely really good. It showcases all of the staples of Lovecraftian horror. It's got the grizzled detective, the prohibition, the cynical cops, the villainous woman, the disillusioned workforce, depression, and good old-fashioned early 20th century filth. Oh. I'm sorry, did I say staples of Lovecraftian horror? I meant staples of film noir. You might expect me to rant about how this is another game getting Lovecraft wrong, but it's actually totally okay. The work of Lovecraft wasn't very far from noir stories. Make noir more reserved, replace the crime with sci-fi, and more or less you've got the same thing. Lovecraft was an early adopter of the I fucking despise life subgenre of popular fiction, and noir is one of the genres that can synergize pretty well with Lovecraftian themes, and here are some more that could do it as well. Now, I've mentioned before that xenophobia is a big part of Lovecraft's settings, and that's definitely true here too, but rather than outwardly being like,
We don't like outsiders, we'll call the fuzz on you if you even think about stealing our rations,
because, you know, that's what they're usually like. Instead, they act like you've just been caught trying to remove those do not remove labels from a mattress.
Whoa there, bucko! You trying to remove that there label? Can't do that under the penalty of law.
No, I'm not trying to remove it.
Oh, okay, that's fine then. You're right.
Except, you know, replace the whole label thing with a sort of generic idea of causing trouble. Overall, people act far more realistically than they do in, say, Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth. The general consensus is not,
let's kill him and blame him for our problems.
It's more,
we're gonna have to explain all of our weird customs to the city boy, aren't we?
And honestly, that may be closer to what Lovecraft wrote in a lot of his stories. It's still xenophobia, but it's not cartoonish. Anyway, we finish up with the town and... wait. What the fuck is this geography? This is not regulation. This is more outlandish than anything I've ever seen a semi-realistic game try to pass off as nothing, and I've seen what Human Revolution thought the 20s were gonna be like. Like, this is where I'm from, and this makes this look accessible by comparison. Holy shit. And the next place we're going to is teetering on the shelves of... that. Looking like the setting of one of those lower effort Scooby-Doo episodes. Anyway, with that rant aside, we move on to Chapter 3, the spooky house, spooky place. And suddenly we're no longer in the land of insane geology, and instead we're into one of the most beautifully bleak landscapes I've ever been presented with, and I've played S.T.A.L.K.E.R. Unfortunately, the way most video renderers and the way YouTube handles low light conditions, it's probably gonna be massacred by the time it reaches you. So instead, look at these screenshots. This looks amazing, and inside the house is pretty as well, if not a bit dark, ridiculously so. And it's at this point the game starts to give you options. Now, I don't really know how significantly these options actually affect the game, but it feels like things could play out in dozens of different ways. Now, that could just be the illusion of choice. These options might be completely redundant. But on my first playthrough, I genuinely felt that my actions had consequences. What would happen if I didn't take the police officer with me? What would happen if I chose to fight this guy rather than reason with him? What if I hadn't found this clue? There are so many variables at play, and that does so much to help immerse you. Sometimes it feels like your choices are completely random though, like, I move this metal sheet. Why? I don't know. It was well hidden though, and the character thought, yeah, that seems important, and then I left. Now this area brings up an interesting question about Lovecraftian media. That question being, what color is it? Well, I don't think there's a specific answer to that. You know, noir has black and white, westerns have beige and brown, cyberpunk has neon, and more neon, and so on. I think the key to Lovecraftian color schemes is consistency. Make everything uniform and recognizable, so that you can later break that consistency to great effect. S.T.A.L.K.E.R does this by having everything be stalker colored, but every so often you find an artifact that is definitely not stalker colored and it stands out massively. In Call of Cthulhu, everything is Call of Cthulhu colored, except for the spookies. It's all very well utilized here and shows an excellent understanding of the visual identity of Lovecraft. Now I know what you're thinking. Painticus, where are these fabled spookies? Well, buckle in, cowboy, because they're coming. Very slowly. Very slowly. Because that's Lovecraft. When we get into the mansion, there's an immediate atmosphere shift. It goes from, I am not welcome here, to, nothing is welcome here. When exploring the house, you'll feel uneasy. Not that there's a feeling of danger, just concern. Lovecraft had a talent for turning the home into the least welcoming place on Earth, and Call of Cthulhu emulates that well. Every so often you'll hear a noise, see a shadow, notice a reflection, or find an item that just puts you on edge. It keeps you there. I adored this section of the game. Well, until this part. So, there's a bit when you hear somebody stumbling around, and you ask if it was your friend, as you would, but you get no answer. But you can go and see your friend just standing around doing fuck all, and neither of you bring it up. Little or large inconsistencies like this bother me immensely. Do you take me for a fool, Bradley? The culty stuff is then introduced, and we're on to the next chapter. The spooky chapter. The second spooky chapter. Now, my notes for this chapter are pretty thin, because what I usually do is play a chapter and then write all of my notes about it. But I played this chapter, and then the next 5 all in one sitting. And yes, that's a good sign. The atmosphere and tone that is established from this point onwards is wonderful. And a few of the potential gripes I had with the game are more or less eliminated. For example, the main character being very noir-y, which I didn't really mind anyway, gets completely overwhelmed upon seeing some creepy stuff, and you get to see this gruff, hardened dude have a full-blown panic attack. And those aren't my words, that's literally what the game says. That's a nice little subversion of a character archetype, and I really enjoyed it. There are also a few moments here that provide such a creeping sense of dread that really impressed me. I won't spoil them, but trust me, they're there. After the KV stuff, we get one of the best, and by best I do not mean accurate, representations of madness that I've seen in media. It genuinely has you questioning what's real and what's not, and that feeling persists for the rest of the game, which is a wonderful trait if you're committing to the madness element of Lovecraft's work. I'm gonna stop covering the main story beats at this point for 2 reasons. 1, I don't want to spoil anything, and 2, at the end I have very little idea what's actually happening. For real, shit gets very Penumbra Requiem-y, and that's half good, half bad. Good because it adds a lot to the themes of madness, but bad because what's happening? This is why the past tense format is so key to Lovecraft's work. It hints at the madness without getting you lost in it. Now, it's not easy to achieve that in games though, not even Stalker attempts it. But if you do want to know what happens in the game and don't want to play it yourself, I will be streaming it at the time shown on screen, and if you missed that, the VOD will be available on my second channel. Now, there's a pretty big thing that I've neglected to mention so far. This is a spooky horror game. So, is it scary? Well, that's a loaded question, because Lovecraft's style of horror isn't the most visceral, immediate kind of horror. It has, at points, gore and disgust, but most of it's psychological. And I don't mean psychological horror in the sense that many use it. Wikipedia lists Cry of Fear, Dead Space, and Silent Hill as psychological horror, because yes, when I see necromorphs scrambling towards me as I rip and crush them to death, I'm thinking, mind games. True psychological horror can't be as easily ignored as ghosts or zombies or demons. Sure, we can safely say that Cthulhu might possibly not exist, but we can't deny what we are, what surrounds us, what might be out there. Our own fragility, mortality, perception. These are the things that cosmic horror targets, not outright fear. So I'll ask again, is Call of Cthulhu scary? Yes. Not extremely, but yes. In most ways, in fact, so that kind of renders that whole spiel more or less redundant, but this is Painticus, get used to it. It has excellent moments of cosmic horror, as well as body horror, unnerving stuff, decent use of darkness,
The Shambler,
creepy level design, and medical gunk. Oh, what's
The Shambler?
I hear you say? Well, I'm glad you asked.
The Shambler.
Somebody asked me recently if there was a way to learn how to make things sound creepy or ominous, and as it turns out, there isn't. So I've tried to pay more attention to the word choices and meanings of certain names, and the Shambler gives me a good place to start. So, what is it? It's an enemy. I won't show it, I don't want to spoil it, but I'll just say this. Why is it called the Shambler? That might not seem important to some of you, but think about the names of other cryptids. Slender Man, Bigfoot, the Abominable Snowman, the Loch Ness Monster, the Beast of Exmoor, and the Mothman. What makes the Shambler sound unnerving? Well, each of these above names describes what it looks like, or where you'll find it. Well, what happens when something can appear anywhere and is beyond physical description? You describe whatever you can. In this case, its most basic kind of movement. The insinuation that it is beyond the earthly equation is truly sinister, and Lovecraft was great at these names. My personal favorite of Lovecraft's would be the Whisperer in Darkness, nice and ominous. But this kind of thing isn't exclusive to HPL, here are a few other good ones. The Skinwalkers, the Nightcrawlers, the Screecher, and the Martyr. That last one is my favorite. But honestly, the game wasn't too scary. Well, until Chapter 9. Fuck Chapter 9. There's not many jump scares in the game, but there is that one. Yowza. Have fun with that when you get to it. I will show this mini jump scare that I had in Chapter 8. Now, I've heard people compare the gameplay of Call of Cthulhu to Amnesia, Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth, and even the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, but none of those really sat right with me. Honestly, the game that it felt closest to was Dishonored, another immersive sim. The world interactions, character interactions, level design, and stealth, yes, there's stealth, all felt very similar. It stops having that lust for darkness / agony feeling in the second chapter, which makes me wonder, why is the first chapter so bad? You have the dream sequence, which shouldn't exist, the clunky walking sim gameplay in the tutorial, which shouldn't exist, the intrusive RPG mechanics, which are introduced in the weirdest way, and yet, as soon as we get to the second chapter, it all just kind of comes together. I think it's because Chapter 1 is ripped straight from the 2010s horror handbook for dummies, while the rest of the game genuinely feels more inspired by games like Dishonored, Thief, and, at times, Scratches. The inconsistency of the opening really put me off, but the rest of the game is, in my opinion, stellar. Do you get it? Because there's stars. Stellar. Because it's like Cthulhu. Okay, so this is one for the scholars out there. It's all about stars because Lovecraft really liked space. And in space there's loads of spooky stuff, and stellar means something to do with stars. Until the ending, that is. The endings are very underwhelming, not because of their content, but because it's very much a Mass Effect 3 style of choose which one you like right at the end, and maybe, if you've been good, there will be an extra ending. And I'm not a huge fan of things like that, but I can't complain too much. It's more about the journey than the destination. Now, a huge gripe that people had with Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth was the gunplay, because, for whatever reason, cough cough, rampant misinformation that oversimplifies Lovecraft's work, cough cough, people think that Lovecraftian games shouldn't have combat. Well, Call of Cthulhu has combat towards the end, and it's fucking hilarious. And you know what? The combat does not feel that out of place. I'm okay with it. Now, before I get on to judging it as a Lovecraftian game, I'll mention some minor things that I really liked, and some others that I really didn't like. What? So, when you sprint with your lighter out, the flame dies down. Cool. When you see some disturbing stuff, you get this electronic screen distortion that's super out of place, but that's good, it shows how unnatural the spookies are. Cool. The audio in general is poorly mixed and the animations aren't good at all, especially lip syncing. Not cool. However, there is some spectacular voice acting in there, mainly towards the end. There are two characters who I would have done differently, the policeman and the doctor, but the detective and the artist truly carry the last act of the game with their performance, and the game didn't need carried. All in all, aside from the shaky intro and endings, I really liked this game. Much more than I thought I would, and I look forward to my second playthrough. I think Call of Cthulhu, for the problems it has, goes in the great category for me. But now for the main question. Does it succeed at being Lovecraftian? Well, let's look at the criteria I set up in my best Lovecraftian game video. Nihilism, irreligion, xenophobia, madness, and isolation. And if you play the game, you'll see that it fits the bill of these very well. Extremely well, in fact. though due to the gaminess of the RPG mechanics and the at-time forced nature of Lovecraft, like the player having visions at the start, which is totally unnecessary, I won't say it's the best or most Lovecraftian game. It was, however, a valiant effort that Lovecraft fans will likely enjoy, minus a few minor gripes here or there. Like, it kind of implies that Cthulhu will rise near the island that the game is set on, but it's actually on the wrong side of the planet, and it kind of mashes up several of his stories in a somewhat messy way, but oh well, it tries and largely succeeds, and I enjoyed it. Well, that was unexpected. Anyway, like I mentioned, I will be streaming a full playthrough of the game at twitch.tv/Painticus at the time on screen right now, and you can also follow me on Twitter at PainticusYT. Now, chances are, if you've stuck around for this long in the video, you might quite enjoy what I make. And you know what? I quite enjoy what I make as well, but unfortunately, because I'm a student with a fairly hectic schedule, I can't always make stuff when I want to make stuff. But I have a solution. You can economically pressure me into making more content. Yay! That is to say that I now have a Patreon page. I'll probably make a dedicated video talking about it, but hey, if you want to jump on it early, it's there. But absolutely no pressure is put on anyone to donate to it. If you cannot afford it or simply do not like the idea of donating to me, that's totally fine. But hey, it exists. So if that interests you, links in the description. Patreon.com/Painticus. And with that, I'm brought to the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe if this is something you enjoy, and I'll see you next time.